Hi, I'm Peggy Oliveira. Thanks so much for joining me today. Today, I am answering a question from Jamie. Jamie is somebody who is familiar with my work, my videos, and had a question about something that I talk about. And the question is around the practice of vulnerability. So, if you've watched any of my other videos or seen my other work, you know that I talk about the importance of vulnerability and the importance of vulnerability in terms of healing, the importance of vulnerability in terms of the impact that it has on how we feel about ourselves and the reinforcement of fears that it creates. So, when I talk about healing, and I haven't always necessarily talked about it this way because I've just kind of contextualized it this way relatively recently in the last handful of years or so. But healing is a practice. And if you've read Deeply Rooted, I talk about that in there, that healing is a process and a practice. And the practice of all emotional healing is how we ultimately change what we believe about who we are. It's how we begin to show up differently in the world. It's how we begin to set boundaries and honor them. It's how we ask for things that we want or need. So it's the practice that gets you up that mountain. Learning, understanding is an important part of that. But without the practice, it just is something that you know. And in fact, it becomes something that you end up kind of beating yourself up about because you know it, so you believe, therefore, you should be doing it differently. But it doesn't work that way, and I've talked about that before too. So, what is the practice of vulnerability? So, obviously, this is my perspective. I first want to talk about why we need to practice vulnerability. So often for people that have been wounded by another person, certainly as a child, but even as an adult, or especially if both, when we have been wounded by somebody, that's relational wounding, and it creates a lot of hurt and doubt. And in that hurt and doubt, as a way to protect ourselves, we disconnect from people. We can sometimes go in a direction where we become kind of enmeshed with people, which is like overconsumed and no boundaries whatsoever. And that does happen. And there are different factors that play into how and why that happens. But generally speaking, in terms of the vulnerability aspect, it doesn't really matter which side of that you're on. But when we are hurt, we generally have this belief, and it's not even a conscious belief necessarily, though it may be. We have this belief that it is not safe to be vulnerable. And we feel vulnerable when we are sharing what we really think or feel, when we're sharing things that we fear being judged by, when we are honest about something that somebody's asking for feedback around because we aren't sure how that's going to land for that person. So, because all of that has the potential to create a circumstance that leaves you feeling hurt or judged or shamed, it's better in our mind and in our body to not risk that vulnerability. And it becomes a significant coping mechanism. In fact, there's a lot of people about like how they might define what vulnerable is. A lot of people that I've talked to actually define it as weakness. And it's not, but that's the experience of it. It feels like it's weakness that allowed somebody to hurt us. It was a moment of weakness that allowed ourselves to hope for something that a part of us knew could never happen. So we equate vulnerability with weakness. But in reality, it is not at all the same. Vulnerability can lead to feeling hurt or being judged. It absolutely can. Because when you're vulnerable and you, for example, share with somebody that you love them for the first time, that's incredibly vulnerable because you may not know how that person is going to respond. Are they going to laugh at you? Are they going to tell you that you're way more involved than they want to be? Are they going to reject you? There is, of course, the possibility that they could say that they love you too. But if we believed that to be true, then we wouldn't feel quite as vulnerable. But when we anticipate, because of what we believe about ourselves from previous experiences, that that person may not feel the same way or may even laugh at us, then or reject us, then that vulnerability feels like fear. And again, we equate fear with weakness. But it's not. You feel that because there's a possibility of it not being reciprocated. That's just a factual, objective thing. But in our body, that intensity, in our expectations, it reinforces an idea that we hold about ourselves, a belief that we hold about ourselves, that we're either not enough, unworthy, undeserving, unlovable, something along that line. But if nobody ever took the risk in telling somebody that they love them, we'd be a very lonely society. And the truth is, we are in so many ways a very lonely society because we are not willing to risk being vulnerable. If you think about social media, while we are so much more connected in many ways than we've ever had the ability to be before, there is also such a much more significant sense of feeling isolated, of feeling alone, of comparing ourselves to other people, which leads to feeling alone and isolation. And why is that? Because the connection that we have with people isn't real connection. It's pseudo connection. All the friends that you have, all the followers that you have, but it's not real connection, because real connection can only happen when the people connected are vulnerable. That's how we build and feel a sense of connection. Liking posts doesn't create connection. Not that there's anything wrong with liking a post, but we have this sense that the more friends I have or the more involved I am in social media, the more connected I am. That's not true unless in that connection, you are being real. Whatever that looks like. You're being honest. Doesn't mean you have to be upfront and share absolutely everything, but what you are sharing, if it's not honest, if it's not aligned and integrated, then it creates disconnection because you know that what you're sharing or what you're posting or what you're commenting on is not what is truly happening within you. So it creates more disconnection. So the practice of vulnerability in regards to emotional healing means that you take risks. Now, I think it's important to really think through those risks. Like, I'm certainly never going to encourage somebody to just suddenly leap in and share something really vulnerable with somebody who you don't feel is necessarily somebody who's shown you that they can be trusted. But we have to practice being vulnerable. And so for many of you, I think the majority of you that will watch this are in the process of some sort of acceptance of some sort of wounding or healing that you want to address. You are maybe a trauma survivor. You're somebody maybe who is in the process of doing some sort of self-growth or healing. And so in those situations, part of how you practice vulnerability is first honoring what is true and present for you. So not just saying you're fine, or not dismissing or denying what's really going on for you, but being honest, being open about that. Now, that doesn't mean be open in every area of your life or with every person in your life. Because the truth is that there are probably a lot of people in your life that are not the right people to talk about really deep personal things with, things that maybe you have a lot of shame around. And there are different reasons for that. It doesn't mean you can't eventually do that, but it's a practice, right? And it's a process. So you kind of need to make sure that that person is somebody that you're likely going to be able to do that and get the kind of support that you would want from that person. So you kind of build up to that. But there are going to be people in your life that you might share really deep personal things with. And that might be a friend, it might be a therapist. But it's important to really reflect on that relationship and identify the maybe small things or the moments when you have shared something and it was received well. You weren't judged. You didn't feel an intense desire to run away and never engage with that person again. Now, you may feel that, but you re-engage and realize it's okay. If you do that and that person never reaches out to you again, then there's going to be some other healing that needs to happen in that relationship before I would encourage anybody to actually share something that's vulnerable. After you've had some practice, you can go back to that person and have a conversation with that person, which itself is actually quite vulnerable. So in those scenarios that I talked about, like a friend or a therapist, practicing vulnerability means that you share something that normally you wouldn't share. And it really may be something as really simple as, what do you want to do? Like if you're going to spend time with that person and you talk about what you want to do you typically let that person decide? Or maybe even make that person decide? Because what if what you want to do seems silly? What if what you want to do means just kind of staying in and hanging out instead of going out and being around a bunch of people? What is that person going to think if you shared that so you don't? And I know there are so many of you that can relate to that kind of thing. So vulnerability in that situation would look like sharing what you want to do, or if there's a suggestion about something to do that you really don't want to do, being able to say that you don't want to do it. Maybe you offer something else instead, but being able to be honest and open with them, but it's also partly being open and honest with yourself. With a therapist, for example, being vulnerable can be sharing things that maybe you don't share with other people. Maybe you've never shared with somebody else. It could be that you're afraid to talk to somebody or to talk to that person about certain things. Just acknowledging that is vulnerable. It may be talking to your therapist about something that's been said or done that caused you to question yourself or question the journey. Being able to be open, be honest. And again, part of that is being open and honest with ourselves, acknowledging what we're really thinking or feeling or wanting. And then being able to express that with somebody else. That's vulnerable. And in that vulnerability, again, it's important to think about who you're being vulnerable with. So in that vulnerability, hopefully, that person is going to respond in a way that is not going to reaffirm your fears. And if they do, you now know that that's not the person to be vulnerable with. And maybe even you know that, okay, that's somebody that you really need to consider some serious boundaries with. But hopefully the response will be good. And good could be not too much of a response at all, or a really significant supportive type of response. And there's not necessarily a right response, generally speaking, but it kind of depends on the circumstance and what it is that you're sharing. But in that practice, in that sharing of being vulnerable, in the response that you get from that person, there is healing that happens. So even somebody not judging you, if you can accept, and this is part of a practice too, if you can accept that there is no judgment, then there's healing that happens there. There's emotional healing that happens there. There's shame healing that happens there. And that is helpful as you continue to move forward. That helps you recognize other ways that you can be vulnerable with that person and potentially with other people. The more mindful we can be about being vulnerable when we're in this emotional healing process, the more opportunity we have to practice in ways that help move you up that mountain. In my course that I have, Journey to Wholeness, so I've had this course for a while, it's a self-paced digital course, but in that course, one of the practices that I have in there is a vulnerability challenge. And that challenge, I've led the course live a few times, and that challenge always brings up stuff for people naturally, because it's not in our natural way of being to be vulnerable. Our self-protective mechanism kicks in to keep us from feeling that sense of vulnerability. Society teaches us from very, very early on that vulnerability is not good, that vulnerability is how you get hurt, that vulnerability is weakness. Again, not true, but that's what we're taught. So leaning in to the practice of vulnerability is how we have and create experiences that help us heal. Because one thing that you've probably heard me say is that healing happens in connection. Well, at the beginning of the video, I talked about connection can only happen when we allow ourselves to be vulnerable. So in order for healing to happen, we have to be connected. We have to really feel a sense of connection with another person, or maybe even a few people. But in order for that connection to happen, we have to be willing to risk being vulnerable. And again, being vulnerable, there's a whole spectrum of things that we can do that are vulnerable. The example I gave, just sharing your honest opinion, your honest desire about something, can be incredibly vulnerable. Telling somebody that you love them for the first time is really vulnerable. Talking about traumatic and relational wounding is really vulnerable. Seeking help, whatever help that might be, is incredibly vulnerable because we view that societally as a weakness. We shouldn't need help. We should be able to handle things on our own. So acknowledging that we need help with something or that we want support can feel incredibly vulnerable. And often when we do that, it can actually create this fear and shame, which can cause us to pull back. And this goes to the video that I did a little while ago around the worst thing that we can do when we feel shame is isolate or pull back, because then it reinforces that there's something to be ashamed of. It reinforces that it's not safe to do that. So we can't do that. We have to stay connected. We have to stay engaged. And in that, while it feels vulnerable, it's a practice that helps us continue to get to that place of healing. So I want to give you just kind of another brief real world example that I think a lot of people can relate to, even if the circumstances are a little bit different. So you might belong to some sort of support group or like a Facebook group in which people talk about vulnerable things. And like if you're somebody going through a divorce, maybe it's about divorce. If you're somebody who's experienced trauma, maybe it's about trauma. If you're somebody who is like over the age of 40 and you're looking for a new job, that can be vulnerable. So there are lots of different types of scenarios that you might find yourself in that can feel a little vulnerable, where you might feel a little bit of fear around being judged or being the only one, that maybe people aren't going to understand. There might be a lot of shame involved. So right now, I'm experimenting a little bit with a Facebook group for my new Returning to Wholeness program, my monthly program. And within this group, and there's also a live call, and there's a lot of vulnerability that's happened there as well. But inside the Facebook group, and I've led other Facebook groups as well, and the same has been true, we can feel this desire to be connected to other people who get it. Yet there's also this fear, and maybe the fear is conscious. Oftentimes it's not conscious. It can show up as avoidance or distraction or even irritability. But there can be this push and pull a little bit. There's a desire to be connected, but a fear about being connected, a fear of being vulnerable, a fear of feeling exposed. And so inside the Facebook group, because I know that connecting is part of the practice of healing and releasing shame, I encourage people to connect on deep levels. And I know that that can feel kind of uncomfortable to people. And I've thought at different times about maybe I shouldn't do that. But that's me giving into ideas and fears that maybe I'm doing it wrong in some way. But I usually am able to let go of that pretty quickly and come back to, it's also why people find the healing that they do in the experiences that I create. So anyway, that's a little bit of an aside, but I ended up continuing with that a little bit because even for me, there can be doubt that creeps in. And for me, doing the Facebook groups that I've done, doing the small group things that I've done, even retreats, while I can have moments of doubt, like, why aren't people engaging? Am I taking them too deep? Or why is nobody wanting to join this? Is it because it's too much, or is it not enough? So those questions can arise, but the more that I'm able to be with that feeling and that uncertainty, I can work through it and connect with what is true. And I can talk about it with people who can support me and help me see and connect back with what is real and true. So, like in a Facebook group, it is inherently vulnerable to be in a space where we're talking about emotional wounding and trauma wounding and healing and shame and boundaries and all of this kind of stuff, right? Inherently vulnerable. But part of what is so healing about being a part of a group like this is that you feel that vulnerability, but you still show up. You connect with other people. You see by their comments that other people are feeling the same ways. People respond to you. You respond to other people in open and honest ways. You're seeing the points of connection between you and other people, the things that you thought made you different or that you felt shame around. Somebody else is saying, this is what I think, or this is what I feel or do. And you're able to say, me too, even if not publicly. And in that moment, healing happens. Now, that's not all the healing that needs to happen, but that is a moment of healing. That is a moment of connection. And so the idea that healing happens in connection, I also will often say healing happens in moments. There is healing that happens in those moments, whether you're aware of it or not. Now, the more aware you can be of it, the more helpful it's going to be ultimately. But even when you're not aware of it, there's this feeling, there's this experience that happens that helps you recognize that you're not alone, that it's okay and safe to connect, that you are connected, and that the shame is not yours. And in that vulnerability, while it is a positive thing, afterwards it can create that sense of, oh my God, what have I done? And this is in that video that I mentioned too, and I'll share a description in the link, or with a link in the description. But in that vulnerability, when you feel that sense of, oh my God, what have I done? That is the self-protective part kicking in. And when you can be with that fear and remind yourself that it's okay, that this is a part of healing, that this is you practicing so that you continue to move up that mountain, then that initial, that kind of intense feeling in your body begins to dissipate, because you recognize physiologically, you recognize that that fear, that feeling doesn't mean that you have to run away in order to be safe, that you can feel that feeling, that you can talk yourself through it and be safe. And when you do it that way, instead of just running away, you have the opportunity to feel into what is real and true. If you run away, you're left with being able to believe that the only reason that you're okay is because you ran. And it reinforces that you had to run because it wasn't safe to share, that what you did was somehow wrong, and you had to protect yourself from it. So the practice of vulnerability is taking mindful steps towards first connecting with what is real and true within yourself, and then taking opportunities to practice doing that with other people. And for many of you, that may be just with your therapist, and that's okay. It really is okay. Now, eventually, you need to practice that outside of that environment, but start small. It's okay to start small, especially if it's with a friend. If it's in some sort of healing group, you can still start small, but it's also hopefully a safe place to practice sharing some of those bigger things, or sharing maybe in a broader way than what you would otherwise. So I hope that feels helpful. So a couple of key takeaways. First, it's natural to feel vulnerable. It is not weakness at all. It is a natural human emotion, an experience. And there are times plenty of times now, that I still feel vulnerable. Plenty of times. And the last couple of months rolling out this new program has brought up a lot of vulnerability. So being vulnerable, there's nothing wrong with it. And it's a natural part of our human experience. If we do not allow ourselves to practice being vulnerable, then we can't really truly be connected. And if we can't truly be connected, we can't truly and deeply heal. And in a way, it actually also keeps us from being able to reconnect to the truth of who we are, to our wholeness, because we're not able to see ourselves in an objective, supportive, and loving way. Because when you don't let people in to really see who you are, to see the struggles, the hurt, the pain, the dreams and the desires, if we don't truly let people see that, or not necessarily everybody, but if we don't let somebody in to see that, then we can never fully trust that person will always be accepting of us. Because we will continue to hold on to, yeah, but if they knew this, or if they saw that I struggled in this way. One of the things I hear all the time is, we create this facade, we wear this mask that everything is perfect, right? If you haven't listened to it, I did a reading of a poem called The Mask in April of this year, and shared it on YouTube. But we create this facade of, I'm fine. How often do you say you're fine when you are not at all fine? And we fear that if anybody saw beyond that they would reject us, that they would judge us, that they wouldn't want to be in our lives. And so when we never let them see us because we're unwilling to be vulnerable with them, to be open and honest with them about what's really going on within us, then no matter how supportive or loving or kind that person is, we will never be able to fully trust it, because in our mind, even if not consciously, we will hold on to the idea that, yeah, but if they knew this, they'd feel differently. If they knew that I struggled with this, then they would see me differently. If they knew that I was a trauma survivor and I experienced all this stuff, they would be shocked and would think that I'm weak. And that one I hear all the time. And I'm going to put this out there. If you should share that with anybody and they think that you're weak, then please move on and cut that person out of your life. And I'm being very honest about that, very serious about that. Because for somebody to say, I had no idea, I'm shocked, part of that is because of the myth that is out there. But while it can feel unsettling and like a not very good response, and in some ways it's really not a very good response, what that person is usually expressing is that they never would have been able to believe that, because the myth is that trauma survivors are sitting in the corner of their room plotting out homicidal or suicidal thoughts. So, and that's a whole other issue. So when we allow ourselves to share things with people, it allows them to get to know us on a deeper level. And that's what creates connection. And if there is ever anybody who responds in a way that is judgmental or shaming, now I want to be clear, you might feel like it is, even if it's not necessarily objectively that way. So this is where sharing with somebody who has maybe shown you in different ways that they're supportive of you, that they believe people in general, that they don't view people struggling as a weakness. And you can know that in part based on how do they talk about things that are happening in the world? How do they talk about other people? How have they shown up for you before? Have they shared something similar with you? So practicing vulnerability is important and necessary in emotional healing, but who you share with is very important as well. So thank you for watching. I hope that that feels helpful. Vulnerability is not easy, but it is important. And the more that we practice being vulnerable, we realize that we can feel that vulnerability, and it's not a bad thing at all. Kind of like when we feel the nervousness of riding on a roller coaster, right? You have all that energy and you're thinking, oh my God, maybe I shouldn't do this. But then you do it and you realize, I want to do that again. I'm not saying you're going to want to show up and be really vulnerable again, but you recognize that that fear can be there, but you can do the thing and it can end up being perfectly okay, and maybe even really good, because it can create such a deep level of connection and support. It can create really meaningful and long-lasting relationships. So I'd like to encourage you to think about, who might you practice being vulnerable with? Maybe there's a space where you can practice being vulnerable. And be mindful about who it is that you're being vulnerable with, asking yourself those questions about how they've shown you that maybe they are the right person to be vulnerable with. And if they've ever shown you objectively some things where they judge people or are dismissive, then maybe that's just not the right person. And it's okay if that person is your therapist. So thanks for watching. I hope that was helpful, Jamie, and to all of you who can relate to any of this, which I think is probably most of you. If you've got a question, please send it to qanda@courageousjourneys.com. That link will also be in the description below. If you've not subscribed, please do so, and give this video a thumbs up if you liked it. It helps other people find this video. And of course, click the bell for notifications if you haven't done so, so you'll be sure to get notified when I release new videos. I'll look forward to seeing you soon.